Hi everyone. Welcome to part 2 of my CSR Communication Evaluation Report. In this presentation, we will take a look at my proposed evaluation framework for H&M's CSR Communication Program. We will investigate all these elements that you can see on the slide. So that includes objectives and audiences, identifying potential metrics, methods, and benchmarks, creating a scoring system, and determining potential feedback processes for further refinement. First, we have to understand what the objectives are. Each CSR communication initiative will have a specific set of objectives that can be subjected to evaluation of whether we are meeting them in an identified timeline. Here are some of the objectives that we can measure. There's messaging. This is the content, both quality and quantity, of the CSR communication program. We have the messaging infrastructure, which includes the medium, audience, and reach. This pertains to who we are engaging, on which platforms, and how narrow or wide we go. And finally, we are going to be considering outcomes, which are the awareness, reputation impact, behavioral impact, and perceived alignment with CSR goals. This section understands the outcomes of our communication efforts. We also have to recognize that targeting different audiences will affect how we evaluate our CSR communication and what factors we need to look at to accurately reflect the success or failure of the program. This acknowledges the nuances between each audience group, fully understanding that each segment has its own expectations and preferred communication methods and channels. After identifying the foundational elements of our CSR communication, we now have to decide the metrics that we're going to use to precisely measure, both qualitatively and quantitatively, the impact of the program. These can be segmented into 3 parts. First is the input metrics, which refers to the budget and resources, such as investment in terms of finance and expertise. There's frequency and volume, which is the number of campaigns launched, as well as the number of messages. And then you have the channels, which are the platforms used, such as social media, digital, press, government or stakeholder reporting, recognizing that each channel has its own associated input requirements. Following our inputs, we want to have a way of directly measuring their yields. We can look at the reach, which is how many people we exposed to the CSR message. There's engagement. How many of those we reached indicated some form of engagement, such as likes, shares, and comments. And then there's message clarity, which is how well they understood our CSR message. Now that we have a direct measure of outputs, our evaluation doesn't stop there. There are mere indicators of reach and engagement, which is not the end goal of CSR communication. We also have to get a clear idea of the outcomes. What did our stakeholders do with those CSR messages? So we want to look at awareness. How did it increase following our CSR communication campaigns? There's reputation, impact. What is the delta in perception of our brand in relation to corporate responsibility? Did it get better, worse, or not move the needle at all? And then there's behavioral impact. After internalizing our message, what actions did our stakeholders take? Were there more donations? From a donation drive, are employees more engaged in spreading the message? Did we increase customer participation? And finally, you can also look at alignment and CSR goals, which is how well did our communication reflect our overarching CSR objectives. Establishing clear metrics allows us to decide on suitable methods to ascertain those indicators. We can use the following: quantitative methods such as surveys and polls to assess awareness and understanding, as well as analytics such as web traffic, social media engagement metrics, and conversion rates. Qualitative methods help us go deeper into concepts that cannot be adequately measured by pure numbers. Using focus groups and content analysis, we can review the tone of stakeholder response and the degree of alignment between communication and CSR objectives. Focus groups can help us gather in-depth insights that contextualize audience perceptions and behaviors. We can also use case studies to document and examine the impact of specific campaigns. Benchmarks are an important tool to understand how well the organization is faring compared to companies in the same industry, such as competitors, as well as established CSR reporting standards. Once we have taken all of these into account, we can create a scoring system that aggregates all of these measures into an easy-to-understand format. Comparing this score against the benchmark will enable us to see if further adjustments are necessary. Finally, a feedback mechanism should be created to incorporate stakeholder feedback so that we can refine our strategy and tactics and yield better results for future campaigns. In the case of H&M, this is what our evaluation framework is going to look like. Certain assumptions are made, such as the objectives, as these are internal factors that cannot be determined with absolute certainty. For years, H&M has received negative press surrounding its transparent CSR communication, with many critics tagging it as transparent greenwashing to appear socially responsible without truly making a significant effort in realizing their promises. Even government agencies have called them out for the hollowness of their CSR communication, as they have been found to not leave a significant impact in environmental sustainability. It stands to reason that changing its reputation among stakeholders is a key objective. Another factor that we will assume is important to the company is consumer behavior. H&M wants to induce action among its customers, such as donating to its garment collection drive and spending more per visit. The stakeholders that we are going to look at primarily are consumers, NGOs, and regulators, given H&M's status as a global fashion retail powerhouse. For metrics, the proposed areas include inputs, specifically budget and channels, and outcomes, such as reputation and behavioral impact. Measuring consumer sentiment into H&M's CSR communication and how they act on those sentiments can provide an illuminating way to assess the success of the program. To reliably measure these areas, we can look at a mix of quantitative and qualitative methods. We can use surveys, which would ask questions like a change in perception, positive or negative, before and after the campaign. It could ask, did the buying intent signals get stronger or weaker? Did stakeholders agree that they were targeted using suitable channels? Did the company communicate too little, too much, or just enough? Sales analytics can look into how little or how much foot traffic and sales get impacted by CSR communication. In focus groups, we can look at what explains the delta in perceptions, attitudes, and behaviors, basically contextualizing the data that we collected. We can also use content analysis that delves into what people are saying and what tone they are using to communicate those responses. The results of these methods can be aggregated into a singular score and compared to a predetermined score at the beginning of the campaign. This scoring system is influenced by a number of theoretical and empirical considerations for CSR communication. Firstly, we have to understand that authenticity, or at least a perception of it, is a foundational element of CSR communication effectiveness. A theoretical framework conceptualized by Andrea Perez underscores the idea of message authenticity as a key predictor for the success or failure of a CSR communication program. An authentic message is viewed as public serving rather than self-serving and attributed to altruistic motives rather than egoistic ones, which in the context of corporations is generating profit. This provides a suitable framework for evaluating H&M's CSR communication, which focuses on perceptual and behavioral outcomes as key objectives. Additionally, we have to consider Kim and Ferguson's findings that explain the inverse relationship between spending, communication volume, and perception of authenticity. In their study, they found that companies that spend too much money on CSR promotion is perceived as hypocritical and self-serving. While few companies make such expenditures public, stakeholders refer to the frequency and volume of CSR messaging to get an idea. Basically, a company that promotes their CSR efforts are logically spending heavily on their CSR communication, and high frequency and volume can have an inverse effect on the perception of authenticity and therefore communication effectiveness. And that brings us to this scoring system, which is divided into two major metric groups. One is the input and the other is the outcome, for a total score of 100 points. So for input, we look at the budget, which deals with perceptions as adequate, too high or too low. We look at frequency and volume, and by looking at it, we apply diminishing returns to this measure, where too high and too low are negative, and an optimal range is positive. For channel, there's two subgroups here. That's the appropriateness, measured based on perceived relevance to stakeholders rather than sheer diversity, and diversity, which emphasizes the effectiveness of the channel selection rather than just being everywhere. And for the outcomes, we look at sentiment or reputation, and that's going to be looking at it from the perspective of positive or negative, authentic or inauthentic, altruistic versus egoistic. And for the sentiment, we're looking at three different audience groups for H&M specifically, and that's consumer, NGO, and the press. For behaviors, we're going to be looking at consumer participation in CSR initiatives such as garment donations for the Garment Collection Initiative, as well as sales figures, which is the delta in the sales boost before and after the campaign. These methods will not only measure the relevance and success of the communication program, but help inform future ones so that they can resonate better with audiences and achieve better results per dollar spent. This establishes a feedback mechanism that gets the company more closely aligned with what consumers and other stakeholders expect from H&M as a legitimate and powerful socioeconomic force.